and welcome to episode 47 of Gar Borras' Time Machine. This is part 2 of episode 47. Today we're going to be talking about the breakout stars of Saturday Night Live. Last time in part 1 we talked about a general history of the show and what it means to people, Gar. So we wanted to kind of talk about, as I said, the breakout stars. Now, as I was sharing with you just before we went on air, when I had the idea to do, part 2 of the breakout stars, I had one idea of all the people I was going to be sure to mention, but it just got to be too long of a list. So this is something we may revisit from time to time because there's so many breakout stars. Now, my first one I had to include George Carlin for the simple fact that he was the very first person to ever host the show.
And when we talked about it before, I just felt that was perfection in just how you would start the show.
Yeah.
It's perfection.
Yeah, it truly is. And so I wanted to kind of, since we're mentioning these people, kind of highlight who George Carlin was. And obviously, as I mentioned, George Carlin hosted the very first episode of Saturday Night Live, which premiered on NBC, as we said, October 11th, 1975. He was one of the breakout stars of Saturday Night Live. He would go on to have a very successful stand-up comedy career, Gar, this is something else I found out. So after he had hosted Saturday Night Live, through the 3 decades of the Johnny Carson era of The Tonight Show, Carlin did his comedy routine on several episodes of The Tonight Show. Over 130 episodes of The Tonight Show. So again, that says something right there about how big of a comedian this guy was in his day.
Well, I just kind of got corrected myself because I was just assuming that everybody would know that.
Yeah.
But it's really kind of a realization right now, that somebody like him is kind of fading in the distance.
Sure.
And the guy was such an incredible comedian. Not a good comedian, an incredible comedian.
Yeah,
There was so much connection to what he was saying. People could relate because they touched on things that everybody knew about or experienced in their everyday lives. But he would just, kind of remind you of all of these things in a very comedic way, and it just worked so well. His style of comedy was very different from everyone else.
Yeah, you're so right, but he's starting to fade, and that's because he passed away a couple years back. But I think he came along at the right time, because I think if he came along, just in the last recent years with all this cancel culture stuff, I don't know that he would have made the mark that he's definitely made. And he was also right at the time to even to be in consideration to host the first guy to host Saturday Night Live, because simple fact, what they were originally known for was touching on like political satire. That's what they were known for at the time. And George Carlin was known for his political satire, where he would comment on American culture, society. Carlin had admitted later that he was, get this, high on cocaine when he hosted the very first SNL episode. And interestingly enough, he wouldn't return to Saturday Night Live until like 9 years later. And I think there was a little bit of controversy because they had suspected that he had done some kind of drugs. I guess they weren't able to really prove it, but years later he admitted to it. And what's interesting is 9 years later he returned, and he had a little bit of he was a little upset about the fact, like I think when they did some big anniversary shows, he wasn't welcome back after that. And yet this is the first, you'd think, at least in the history of a show, that they would welcome him back for the simple fact that he was the very first host of a show.
Well, who knows, because there's always personal things that go on behind the curtain, that we don't really know
about.
Sure. So to really, voice anything would be just pure speculation.
Sure, and then I'll, in regards to George Carlin, we'll end on this. He sadly suffered a heart attack on June 22nd at the I forget what age, but it said he was at age of 71. I forget what year it was, but it said June 22nd some year he died. But I know the death was just like 2 or 3 years ago, something like that.
Well, he wasn't a good comedian. He was a great comedian.
Yeah.
I cannot say enough about him as his body of work speaks for itself.
Oh, sure.
And anyone that isn't familiar with his comedy, I highly recommend. People dig him back up. Yeah, I'm sure you'll be able to find him on YouTube and stuff like that, and you'll be able to find incredible stand-up comedy. He really his style really connected with the generation at that time.
Yeah.
And it's just kind of like a snapshot of that time period. Where everything was, like the way it was, I will always have a warm place in my heart for his style of comedy that I really haven't seen anyone else follow in that type of footsteps.
Yeah.
Where he's taking things that, we experience in everyday lives and realizing the comedy of it, because we experience those things and we don't even think about it. But through his lens, you see the comedy in it, and it was wonderful. It really was great comedy.
And again, while we're talking about the breakout stars of Saturday Night Live, and we're on the subject of George Carlin, before wrapping up the section on him, I should also mention another thing that kind of proves just his star power and the kind of success that he went on to have is, besides being a huge successful stand-up comedian, he would go on to earn 5 Grammy Awards for many of his comedy albums. And again, when we think of somebody winning a Grammy Award, I mean, that they didn't always give Grammy Awards for like the best comedy album. That became a thing years ago, but it wasn't always the case. So the fact that a stand-up comedian is able to win 5 Grammys for his comedy albums, that's quite significant.
It was also during a time where comedy albums were very popular. It's a completely non-necessary thing nowadays, but in the 50s and the 60s and the 70s, comedy albums, listening to an album of a comedian doing his stand-up act was a very popular thing. And because it's been so many generations since then, people
forget.
Really, people. It's just a faded memory now. But back in the 50s, 60s, and the 70s, that was really kind of the norm.
Yeah, I mean, I urge people, you can go on YouTube and if you type in George Carlin, all kinds of his acts and routines will come up. And I was also reading that in 1977 he did his first of 14 comedy specials for HBO. And as getting back to people putting out comedy albums back in the day, I mean, some that were really known for that. Right off the top of my head, they were some of them were controversial. Red Fox, of course, would go on to have success with Sanford and Son. He was very big in the comedy clubs, early on in his career before anybody really knew who he was. And another one, Bill Cosby, Sam Kinison,
Well, and that's why I was saying, I think Sam Kinison was kind of like one of the last of
that breed. That breed.
Yeah, that breed. But it really was, the norm, and and that's where it kind of he got his reputation as to why he would be considered as the first host
of Saturday Night Live,
of the show. But I most of the breakout stars that I decided to put on this radar were mostly people that were performing on the show. But you have to also mention Steve Martin.
Oh, sure.
You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Because Steve Martin, he was a very just like George Carlin, he was a very successful stand-up comedian. But he was very little known to the mainstream masses.
Yeah.
And so he doing his guest hosts on Saturday Night Live really skyrocketed his career.
Oh, sure.
And it really he really owes how his career skyrocketed. He owes it to Saturday Night Live. Before he did those guest hosts, mainstream America did not know who he was. Yeah. And after he did those hosts, instantaneously, mainstream America all knew who he was, because he wasn't just guest hosting. It was his skits that he was doing on that, over time became iconic skits.
Yeah, like you said, he would come back and do the King Tut skits. That was just, one of many, but a wild and crazy guy.
I talked about this before in other episodes.
Yeah.
After they did the King Tut skit, it was water cooler conversation everywhere. I went to school and kids were doing the King Tut, with their arms, and all that stuff, and it was just it was the equivalent of what we call now viral.
Oh, sure, and that's why
when something becomes viral on the internet.
That's why.
Well,
yeah.
King Tut. That is exactly what happened when he, introduced that skit on Saturday Night Live. It became viral before computers or viral was even a thing.
And that's why he would get invited back time after time, because anytime Steve Martin would come on, the ratings would just be, they'd just be skyrocketed. And it also, just think about for a minute, Gar, what we're talking about. The guy's comical take on King Tut. He made people think of King Tut in a way they had never thought of before. And let's also talk about the fact that Steve Martin is not what your typical movie star is. From very back in the 70s, when we're talking about when he first appeared on Saturday Night Live, very first time I've ever seen Steve Martin, he was very young back then. He's always looked like an old man. He's always had white hair, and
oh, yes.
yeah, and so there's that, and I could see why after he had the success on Saturday Night Live, he would go into the movies, because besides being a great comedian, he does look like he could play the part of an older father or middle-aged man, and that's kind of been his role throughout all the different movies he's done throughout his career.
Well, his first movie, was released back in the 80s. It was called The Jerk.
Yeah, I remember that. Yeah,
and it was a very natural, smooth transition for him.
Yeah.
He obviously his people, that he had, at that time saw the opportunities. And those doors became open, and because of the huge success of The Jerk, it just from then on it just became his thing that he was no longer doing stand-up comedy anymore. He was doing movies.
Yeah.
And from then on, he was a movie actor.
Yeah, But
before that, he was a very successful stand-up comedian. His career skyrocketed when he did his appearances on Saturday Night Live, and he's had a very solid career after. But he owes all of it really to Saturday Night Live.
And you know,
that was the capturing lightning in a bottle.
Oh,
right
sure.
There.
And you know, Gar, what's funny about it is, again, I go back to the point that he does not look like your typical movie star. Not that he's ugly or anything, but, you know, I mean, this thing about having to have a young look, I mean, he never had a young look, but he was able to use that, and it worked for him. And he's gone on to have a huge movie career. He's also, these days, we don't see him too much in the movies anymore, I guess, because maybe he's really starting to really look like an old man because he's getting up there in age. But also there's the fact that these days he's still successful. He's writing books more and more. He's a playwright, from what I understand. So he's kind of had that kind of career where he's been able to transition from one thing to another.
Well, there are, there are just a handful of skits that I have seen in my life on Saturday Night Live, and to this day, they hold such a incredible spot in my heart, because they were just such profound experiences, such profound performances.
Yeah.
And Steve Martin's one was the Wild and Crazy Guys from Czechoslovakia.
Yeah, we talked about that last episode.
That skit, it became a recurring.
Sure.
Whenever he would come back, they would revisit the Wild and Crazy Guys, and that was just everybody that was. You knew you were watching Genius.
Yeah.
You really knew it because you were laughing so hard and just wondering in your mind, where in the hell did they come up with this idea?
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Because it's genius. It is hilarious. It is funny. And anyone that listens to this that doesn't know what we're talking about, I highly, highly recommend that you go on YouTube and search out these skits that Steve Martin was doing with Dan Aykroyd, because they are absolute genius and hilarious at the same time.
Which brings me to a great point, Gar, as you just pointed out. Shows like this, Saturday Night Live, like when I was doing the research for part one of this last time, I went on YouTube and did a lot of research. I typed in, like Steve Martin, for example, on Saturday Night Live. A whole bunch of stuff come up, and I see other things, like other clips people would put together, like, the 10 most controversial Saturday Night Live episodes and stuff. And it gives a great history on the show. And shows like this, and we talked about Family Feud and game shows and stuff like that from back in the day, they were having a second life on YouTube. People were discovering these classic episodes from back in the day on YouTube. And it's just giving these classic shows like a new life.
Well, and rightly so, because, for me, when I was younger, in my kind of high school age, and just out of high school age, I was really into everything that was black and white.
Yeah.
And that was my retro kind of thing. During that time period, even though retro didn't exist, it wasn't even a term at that time. But that was basically me, waxing retro, and it's all of those old movies and stuff like that really attracted me. So anyone nowadays that shares that same kind of retro thing, that they might be going through in their lives, this is a great example of a way for you to be able to go to YouTube and discover something, and maybe find something that you are into, or something now that something from the past that is absolutely great comedy that you can enjoy today.
Yeah, well,
these episodes that we're talking about, that made these people breakout stars are still hilariously funny today.
Oh, sure. And Gar, the other thing is, you may laugh when I say this, but something like from the early '90s, something like The Real World, which was a reality show they had on MTV, was one of the very first reality shows. Something all these years later, like The Real World, that is considered retro. I mean, retro can be from really any generation you want, because if you give it a certain distance in time. But we should also mention and talk about a show like Saturday Night Live. What is very interesting, like in looking back on this show, is, for example, talk about Steve Martin right now and what he created with that King Tut skit, or the Wild and Crazy Guys. When you hear people talk about, we know right away we're talking about Steve Martin. And I don't know if anybody of the show or the people like Steve Martin that created these little skits ever thought about copywriting. Like for example, you could imagine, and Saturday Night Live might have the right to do this. Say, we're going to have some modern day comedian come on, and they're going to do a retake of Steve Martin's classic King Tut bit. I mean, I could imagine the backlash. People saying, "Oh, you think you're Steve Martin?" Could you just imagine?
Well, I'm sure that has crossed the decision makers' minds at some point in time during the history of that show, and I guarantee you, it was shot down for that reason.
Yeah,
why even attempt to do something that you're setting yourself up for backlash?
Yeah, and the other thing we need to mention while we're talking about a show like Saturday Night Live, before we get to the next person on each of our list, is that in reference to the comedians on that show, they do have staff writers, but many of the comedians had a thing about being very insistent that they write their own skits. Like I said, for example, Steve Martin, he's into playwriting and writing books these days. But a lot of these guys, like when we get in my next person on my list, we're going to talk a little bit about this. But they also had a thing about wanting to write their own skit, their own comedy routines. A lot of stand-up comedians have a thing about that, and we bring this up in modern world because currently all the writers being on strike and the Screen Actors Guild and all that. I mean, that's why, like, if Saturday Night Live was doing new episodes currently, they're off for the season, they wouldn't be able to do any new shows because that kind of a show depends really on the writers, and if you're not allowed to have the writers take part, you don't have much of a show.
Well, and during the writers' strike back in the '80s. It was really, really obvious because there was a huge dip in the quality of what was being put on TV during that time.
Mm-hmm.
The writers are on strike nowadays, and they have very good reasons as to why they are on strike, and they are proving right now why we need
writers.
Well, unions.
Yeah, unions. Yeah.
The studios have done a really good job at not allowing the public to see that dip in quality. What they've done nowadays is they prepared ahead of time to be able to, because that was part of the reason why the writers won the last time, was because the quality of what was being put on TV was taking such a drastic dip in quality.
Oh, sure.
And so the studios wound up having to relinquish. But they're really kind of battling this nowadays in a much different way, and hiding the actual effects of the strikers withdrawing their work and not making their work available.
Yeah, it's very interesting how it's going to play out. I can't wait to see. And next up on my list, Gar, I had to include this guy because he's one of my favorite actors that broke out of Saturday Night Live. Chevy Chase. Now, here's what I found out. prior to appearing on Saturday Night Live in 1975, things that were noteworthy about Chevy Chase is that in 1967, he wrote a one-page spoof of Mission Impossible for Mad Magazine. I mean, just imagine that. I mean, not only did he write a spoof, but a one-page spoof. I mean, that takes a lot of talent, you know.
Well, I didn't really include the original cast.
Yeah, that's fine.
As breakout stars because I mean it's almost like virtually every one of them became a breakout star.
Yeah.
And has had iconic careers. Since then, and I figured, since everybody pretty much knows, because of, the huge body of work that every one of them has.
Yeah.
I chose to kind of pick some that were,
not as maybe like obvious.
On,
yeah.
And maybe but yet still having the opportunity to have that same kind of success. Say, for example, Eddie Murphy.
There you go. Yeah, he's interesting.
Eddie Murphy is a breakout star that's not from that original cast, and Eddie Murphy not only is a breakout star, but he is highly credited for saving the show.
Oh, I read that.
Because the show was right on the verge of being canceled.
Yeah.
And it was almost like a foregone conclusion at the time. And then he hit so hard.
Gar,
man, he had a huge effect on the popularity of that show. Virtually everything he touched on that show turned into gold, and virtually everything he touched after he left the show turned into gold.
Yeah.
So he's not part of the original cast, but yet he has had a huge, iconic amount of success.
No doubt about that. And I got to say, Gar, in doing today's show, like I was sharing with you the other day through email, immediately I decided, okay, I'm going to limit my list to like 4 people because there's just too many people to do in one show. But definitely Eddie Murphy was on my list, so it's interesting that we both have him on our list, and you've already stated so many reasons why you included him. Another thing, as we mentioned last time, and bringing up Eddie Murphy, is he was known for playing the role of Buckwheat, and he also was known, pretty popular character. He did like a modern day version, kind of the popular cartoon character Gumby. And what I was reading that was interesting about that is both the guy that created Gumby originally and his son. They were both big fans of Eddie Murphy's portrayal of Gumby, so that was pretty good, I thought, and pretty interesting that those people that originally were involved in creating Gumby like just dug what Eddie Murphy was doing with it.
Well, for my generation, Gumby was my early childhood.
Yeah.
When I was a young, preschool age, and Gumby was a huge part of that, and everyone that was part of that generation that was growing up at that same time, we all, Gumby was a very special part of our lives. And so for future generations that really don't understand how Gumby was iconic back then, really, Gumby was iconic back then.
I mean, I remember,
but now, it's a lost thing, where for the whole appreciation about the Gumby thing is kind of lost. But if you go back and you watch his James Brown stuff, it's incredible. He did a great James Brown. He really brought great comedy to it.
Oh yeah, and and the thing too is he a great comedy. He also kind of did his little attempt at being a singer. If you remember, he did I think it was around 1984, 85. He did that video with Rick James, Party All the Time.
Party All all the time, man. That song was a big hit.
Yeah.
I remember hearing that on the radio, and it was like part of the top 10.
It was, yeah.
It was constantly being played. It wasn't just the fact that, oh my gosh, he had a record that. No, that song was being played in regular rotation with everybody else.
In fact, this will give you a flashback. I remember seeing the video for that on, of all places. Remember Casey Kasem used to have a top 10 video show. It got featured on there. It was all over radio, like you said. And especially back in the 80s, you always had these actors that had their dream of being like a rock star, musician, and you had rock stars who had dreams about being movie stars, and we've seen sometimes that would get to play out. But like I included, Eddie Murphy too, and Chevy Chase as breakout stars, because simple fact, we often think, like, I remember seeing the show, back in the day, thinking, where did they find these people? And like, it was interesting to read that, Chevy Chase, before he had his big breakout success on Saturday Night Live, he would write a spoof for, Mad Magazine of all things. And then I find out he also was a writer before Saturday Night Live on a Smothers Brothers, comedy special. So again, a lot of these guys coming up as a comedian, they kind of have their roots as anybody. And it's interesting to find when he has success on Saturday Night Live. I know he was very involved also with the writing. In fact, initially, this is what's interesting. I don't know if most people know this. Initially, Chevy Chase was hired on Saturday Night Live as a writer, and then Lorne Michaels or somebody during a rehearsal, they seen something else. And I don't know if it was just his writing or during rehearsal, they decided to hire him as a cast member. So originally, he was just hired as a Saturday Night Live writer.
Well, everybody's got to get your start somewhere.
Oh, sure.
Chevy Chase, is a breakout star because he is the first breakout star, because he's the first to have left the show. And then when he left the show, he immediately went to making movies. And I remember there was a movie that he did with Goldie Hawn that was absolutely hilarious.
I think it was called Foul Play. Foul Play.
Foul Play, yes.
Yeah.
And that movie was hilarious. And it springboarded him into the movie star that he eventually became. But had Foul Play not been
a success,
huge success, he probably would not have gotten those other opportunities, to do, all those vacations and all of that other stuff.
And
but he really did take a serious gamble when he left Saturday Night Live.
Yeah.
Because really, it was a pivotal point. When he left, it could have gone either way. It really could have. And
I understand the reason he decided not to stay with the show is his wife at the time did not want to live in New York City. And so, again, like you said, he took a big gamble. And here's another interesting thing, though. I think it was in the early 90s, around 93, when he had... he tried to do his TV talk show, and that was the only thing like that really was a bomb for him. But I was reading when he did that Chevy Chase talk show, he tried to bring back the Weekend Update as part of that show, but the show itself only lasted for 6 weeks.
For some reason, and I have a feeling the only people that really know are the people that were behind the curtain.
Sure.
But it just was not meant to be.
And again, I bring that up only the fact because I was reading again, like that he wanted to bring up the thing he was known most for, the Weekend Update show from Saturday Night Live. Again, that's a great example of somebody trying to kind of go back and live off of past success.
Well, who knows? He might have been the actual creator of it.
I mean, again, he was a writer, so who knows? Yeah. And again, I was just going to say, it's interesting that we both include Eddie Murphy. So I'd like to hear who's next on your list, Gar.
Chris Farley.
Oh, great choice. Great choice. Yeah.
Chris Farley was, even though he successfully, after he left the show, was very successful with his movies. I mean, really super successful. But his character, Foley.
Yeah.
Matt Foley. To me, just like King Tut, that episode is in that top 5 that I was talking about earlier in our episode about this.
Yeah.
Because you cannot watch that guy, do that character. He's supposed to be a motivational speaker.
Yeah.
And I have a feeling that his character is based on a real person. There is a real person that he saw in his life that he decided, I've got to make a character out of this guy.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? And that just blows my mind. There is an actual person that character is based on.
Well, I mean,
because when you watch it,
there
is no way that you will not laugh. I mean, it is virtually impossible to not find those skits hilarious.
I mean, it's funny, but so oftentimes, comedians take things from their real everyday life. I mean, I remember when we did the episode on Christmas Vacation, reading that Randy Quaid was talking about the character that he played, in that throughout those vacation movies. He based that character on some guy that he really knew in his life growing up, that was somewhat disabled, but he's like, that was my tribute to that guy. I based that character on, that guy I knew.
Well, all I can say is he's got a lot of characters that he's famous for doing on Saturday Night Live. But Matt Foley is, it's genius. It is pure out and out genius. The movements that he does, the body movements, the body movements alone are hilarious.
Yeah, I mean, again, he was one of those comedians too. I think he was a little overweight. He used that to his benefit. I mean, I think if he was around, there's a thing about, we can't make fat jokes or anything like that. But he made it work for him, if you know what I mean. And it was allowed when he was doing it. And I don't know if this is fair to say, but I kind of wonder too, Gar, because he was funny in his own right. He had his own thing going. But I kind of wonder when somebody first discovered him and they brought up the idea of having him on Saturday Night Live, maybe in the Saturday Night Live office, if somebody didn't say, this guy Chris Farley, he's having success in the clubs. He's a very funny guy. He's a John Belushi type. I mean, do you think those conversations ever went on?
Well, who knows?
Yeah,
it's all pure speculation.
Yeah, speculation. Yeah.
But he did make it on the show.
Yeah.
He was a breakout star.
I definitely agree with that. For the fact that like all these guys we've mentioned, what really to me makes them breakout stars is not the fact that they started out on Saturday Night Live, but the fact that they all went on to have greater success. And it's interesting because Chris Farley, he's definitely a guy that would have been on my list if I'd had time to make a longer list. But definitely, I agree that he deserves to be on your list because he had huge success after leaving Saturday Night. Very much like John Belushi, it's sad that he died tragically young. But even with that being said, look at very much like Belushi, look at the legacy of work he left behind. I mean, when you bring up the name Chris Farley, for example, I immediately go to Tommy Boy. That's one of my all-time favorite movies that he did.
It's a great movie.
Yeah.
All the elements for you to love his character are there.
Yeah.
In that movie.
And I think too, if that was the only movie he was known for, I would still say he made his mark on the world because even though he tragically died horribly young because of his drug addiction, we're still talking about him. So his life had meaning, if you know what I mean. He made his mark.
Well, and that's the reason why I wanted to mention him. He's that skit that he did is in my top 5.
Sure.
Of favorite skits. Do you have another one? Because I mean, you're right. This is just eating up the clock.
Yeah.
And there's so much more to go.
Well, I'll tell you, Gar.
You know what? We might need to do a part 2 of this. I don't know.
I mean,
let's talk about it.
Yeah.
Because a part 2 might not be a good decision.
Well, not right now, but I think even maybe wait a couple of months. But I think it's definitely something we could revisit. And see, I think to do the second part next week might be too soon, but because we're already going to talk next time about the musical guest. But I definitely think this is something we could revisit and people would not get bored with because there's just so many breakout stars. I do think somebody would check back if we were to do a part 2 of this.
Yes, because but who's yours?
Okay, my next one. This is my final one because, like I said, I also included Eddie Murphy, so we don't need to go into Eddie Murphy. John Belushi again. John Belushi was one of the original 7 Saturday Night Live cast members. He was both a comedian and a musician, which I think makes him stand out alone. Because again, like we're talking about George Carlin, he's not really a musician, but I mean, the fact that he won 5 Grammys for putting out comedy albums. I mean, John Belushi was a real musician. He was a comedian, and I think that's the way they came up with the idea for the Blues Brothers, him and Dan Aykroyd. And what's interesting is in doing the research, I came across an interview with, of all people, Paul Schaefer, who of course was a keyboard player and a band leader on David Letterman's show, and he was considered to be one of the original Blues Brothers, but because he was so busy touring with and doing other things, he was unable to commit to it. But that just goes to show you how serious the Blues Brothers was. That they have somebody, Paul Schaefer, who also, like Belushi, was a real musician himself, and he almost got to take part in it.
Well, Animal House.
Yeah, of course, that's the movie.
And the Blues Brothers will go down in history as 2 historically great movies.
Oh, sure.
Both of them were hugely successful for their time, and also very powerful in the comedy that they were jettisoning, because it was a new style of comedy that was being introduced to the world at that time.
Yeah.
When that was when he was doing that, and Bill Murray was doing Stripes, and all of those 70s movies that the cast of Saturday Night Live were now experimenting with doing movies while they were still doing Saturday Night Live.
Oh yeah.
And it's those 2 movies for John Belushi are historical movies.
And
when you talk about achievement,
yeah,
that is stratospheric achievement for somebody that died early.
Yeah, I mean,
died at a young age.
That's why
really to fathom, to get your mind wrapped around that he achieved that huge of an amount of iconic success.
Yeah.
At such an early part of his life.
That's why I thought immediately he had to be included on the list, because here's the interesting thing with that. You say the early part of his life. I mean, he died tragically young, so it sounds funny when you say that. But that being the case too, you got to look at the fact that just on those 2 movies, anytime you hear the name John Belushi, people immediately go to the Blues Brothers. They immediately go to Animal House. And here's another thing, very much like Chevy Chase's vacation movies, Animal House was also a National Lampoon movie, so there's that connection there. And again, the fact that he's got pretty much these 2 movies, his work on Saturday Night Live, the Blues Brothers became a huge thing. Even after he died, Dan Aykroyd's carried on with other people, and I guess it was actually his friendship with Dan Aykroyd that got him on the show, because they had played in the clubs together, and it was actually Aykroyd who recommended Belushi to Lorne Michaels.
Well, it's good to have friends in the right places.
So thank you, Dan Aykroyd. But again, and very much like we're talking about Chris Farley. I mean, you look at John Belushi, and he's not your immediate pick to be like a successful, a successful actor or comedian or anything. I mean, he wasn't the most gorgeous guy, but you know what? It didn't matter. Because he had the talent as a comedian to do what he did. He created those characters and even the Blues Brothers. That was all he was ever remembered for. He created quite a legacy. I mean, like I was saying, you could go on YouTube, type in Blues Brothers. I'm sure the movies would come up, but they've released several albums. You can go and check out the songs. Like I said, that became a big part of a musical guest on Saturday Night Live. I'm just think about that. So. When he's appearing as the Blues Brothers with Dan Aykroyd, they're both a comedy act and a musical act at the same time.
That's his genius.
Yeah.
That it really is his genius, because it's something that he developed himself. It wasn't that he saw somebody else and he was modeling after. No, this all came from his own creative mind. Yeah, and as we sit here talking about this, Gar, it just popped in my head the fact that the not only the people we've mentioned so far for today's episode, but I think anytime that we've mentioned like any kind of famous skit from Saturday Night Live, everything from the Blues Brothers, Coneheads, and stuff like that. It's not that Saturday Night Live hired these people and said, okay, we've created this routine for you that we want you to act in. These guys very much created the skit, and those are the most memorable Saturday Night Live skits, are the ones that these actors came on and created themselves. Yep. Now, I got one.
I want to hear it, yeah.
Will Ferrell.
Definitely. I mean, definitely a movie that really comes to mind, obviously, is Old School. When I think of him.
Virtually every scene that Will Ferrell does in the movie Old School is hilarious.
I mean, there's one scene where he's running down the street butt naked. I mean, I remember I seen that for the first time, like, what the hell? But, cannot help but laugh at it.
That, honestly, he's done a lot of really funny movies.
Anchorman's another one. Anchorman. Yeah.
But to me, my personal favorite is Old School.
Yeah.
And virtually every scene Will Ferrell does in that movie is hilarious. The part where he's telling everybody that we can't be freaking out.
Yeah.
We got too much on the line. We can't be, and the whole time
he's freaking out. Yeah,
he's freaking out.
Yeah, and like I said, another movie I love that he.
Hilarious.
Another movie I love that he did. Of course, he had the starring Roland was Anchorman. But isn't it funny? Because I will admit, sitting here and talking to you, Gar. As funny as I thought Anchorman was, it's funny that Old School is a movie, when I hear Will Ferrell's name, that immediately comes to mind. And I bring that up because in Old School, he's like a sidekick character. He's not even the star of the movie. And yet his scenes are so memorable.
You're right about it. And that's an organic thing.
Yeah.
Maybe when you look at when they list the stars, he is not the lead character.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And as time has gone by, the public recognizes him as the lead character in that movie.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And then, you're so right. But again, that just goes to his level as a talent as a comedian. But you're so right. Another one I didn't include, but I think we could include on a future episode or deserves an honorable mention here is Adam Sandler.
Another one that mixed comedy with music,
yeah.
and it's these songs that he does, these comedy songs. They're good.
Yeah, that's the thing. I gotta make note of. You're so right, because you really hit it on the nail there, Gar. Because people hear the name Adam Sandler, they obviously think of like Happy Gilmore and stuff like that. And he's just a funny comedian. But I love the fact that he really deserves to be taken seriously as a musician, because those songs you can type in Adam Sandler and some of his songs will come up on YouTube. But he is really a gifted songwriter, musician. I mean, these are really not just comedy bits; they're actual songs.
Yes, and well, and when he does The Wedding Singer, and he's
Yeah.
he does that song where that really dark song. I hope you joke, and all that
Yeah.
stuff. It's so dark, but yet
You can't help but laugh.
Hilarious.
I mean, it's so funny too, because you can't believe what you're seeing, you can't believe what you're hearing, and yet the rest of the people in the theater are laughing right along with you.
My God, and you really cannot take it away from Adam Sandler. He was, the opera man.
Yeah.
On Saturday Night Live. That was a great character. He was hugely loved when he was on the show.
Yeah.
But he just became a megastar when he left the show and started doing movies.
Yeah, and
he had a really long run
Sure.
of movies that were, I mean, they were all really funny. I don't know what's happened, because nowadays, I just seem to kind of have a little bit of apprehension, because I've had a few that I've watched that he's done lately in the more recent years, and they were not good.
Yeah.
They weren't funny. So I don't know what's really happened. He's kind of lost the funny bone.
Yeah.
But he really had a really long run of putting out some really funny movies.
And that's why, like, he's at a place in his career, I think, where if he never did another one of those movies, I think it would be all right, because the legacy of most of us, like even The Waterboy, and I love that for so many reasons. But the fact that Henry Winkler's in it, has that bit part as a coach. I mean, it's very much like
there were football fans that didn't like it.
Yeah.
I'm a football fan, and I loved that movie.
Like, I love the fact that they included Henry Winkler, because he hadn't done anything like on TV or film in years, and that was the first role he'd done in years. And I'm like, yeah, the Fonz. That was my immediately kind of reaction.
Well, that movie reintroduced Henry Winkler to the public, and really kind of was the starting for that second
part of his career.
Second breath of his career. He's and it was kind of a slow build-up.
Yeah.
But when he started with another Saturday Night Live alum doing that show Barry, now Henry Winkler has really had a second shot at this whole thing. He's doing commercials now.
Yeah.
He's doing parts in shows, parts in movies, and stuff like that. So he's really getting a lot of work, and he's almost
80 years old. I mean, there's that.
Barry really helped that along. With Barry, the main character in Barry is also another guy from Saturday Night Live that has also I don't know if I'd really call him a breakout star, but he's really having another follow-up career since Saturday Night Live, and is doing very well too.
Yeah, and I love the fact, while we're on the subject of Henry Winkler appearing in The Waterboy, him getting that second breath to his career, because what's funny is we sit here and talk about it, Gar, while you and me will always think of him and know him as the Fonz from Happy Days. There are teenagers today who know nothing about Happy Days or the Fonz. They might know him more from his appearance in The Waterboy, and that's iconic in its own place. But it's just as time passes on, and he's still a working actor, like you said. He almost 80 years old, and he's still doing it. Gotta love it, you know.
Yes, and just another feather in Will Ferrell's cap.
Yeah.
You know, another thing that just will live on for indefinitely.
Yeah.
Cowbell.
Oh, there you go. Yeah. We talked about that last time. The Blue Oyster Cult reference. Yeah.
My God, that skit will live on, and that whole the comedy about cowbell. I just see that going on indefinitely. Who knows when that might, just become something, that
Who knows? Who knows? And before we wrap up today's show, Gar, I just gotta say, so often that we get an idea for a show, and like these first two parts of the Saturday Night Live special we're currently doing have turned out so great. But I think part of the reason for doing the episode on Saturday Night Live, I felt the need to do, because I think initially, when whoever got the idea for Saturday Night Live, I don't think that they ever envisioned that these people that they would have appear on the show would, like you said, they had that original cast, and I don't think initially they thought that any of these people were going to leave the show and go on to have bigger and bigger success. And so immediately I felt that there was a need to kind of highlight some of these breakout stars. And like you said, what makes a breakout star? That kind of depends on who you're talking about. But the people we talked about today and highlighted, I mean, they've all gone on to have huge careers. They all, when you think of what they did on Saturday Night Live, they all had a significant presence on the show,
Well, and there's so many more
that we haven't even mentioned, which is why I guarantee
so many more.
Which I guarantee we're going to revisit this topic, because I do want to down the line highlight some of these other people. Just too many to do in one episode. And that doesn't mean we can't do it again, because this made me realize in doing this episode on Saturday Night Live, there are going to be other episodes like this where we come across stuff like this. It's just too hard to get it all down in even two episodes. So
absolutely.
Anybody else on your list, Gar, that you want to go before we wrap this up today?
Oh gosh, let me see. Eddie Murphy. Oh, Molly Shannon.
Okay, yeah, definitely. Yeah.
Molly Shannon. She went on to do that the rock star movies,
sure,
and stuff like that, and her character in what's that movie? Oh gosh, the racing movie, Ballad of Ricky Bobby.
Oh, there you go. Yeah. I forgot about that.
That's another Will Ferrell movie, but her character in that movie, Ballad of Ricky Bobby, is just, oh my God. You cannot deny that is the work of a great comedian.
Yeah. And wrapping up today's episode, the final thing I'm going to say in reference to Will Ferrell, great actor, he's a great comedian. I think he's better oftentimes in like these little bit parts, like we mentioned in Old School. It's funny that a lot of these guys try their hand at directing and creating their own films. He's one of these guys that has tried to do that. I don't think he's as successful doing that. I think he's more successful at comedy when he has other people write it for him.
Well, all I know is, there's very little that Will Ferrell has put out.
Yeah.
That I haven't liked.
Well, like one that comes to mind is the one about the race car tailgate night. I know that wasn't didn't really do good at the box office. I mean, I liked it for what it was, but a lot of people did not like that.
Oh my God, The Ballad of Ricky Bobby is it's one of my favorite movies. It's one of those movies that when I'm flipping the channels and then all of a sudden I come across that, I'll stop and I'll stay and I'll watch.
Well, Gar Borras, I can't believe 60 minutes has passed again, but let's wrap it up, Dave. You can hold on for just...
Chaotic Riffs Magazine.